I'm James Andrew Forsyth, and my name's Drew for short. I'm here to talk about my grandfather, Stanley James Forsyth. He fought in the First World War and enlisted and was taken prisoner of war over there, and came home to have a daughter and 6 sons. Born 7th of September 1895 at Flinders, Australia, and educated at Peak Crossing. And they had a farm there, and it's where they mined the Flinders dolomite. It was on that property, and the house is still standing. That's one of Stanley James and Percy Samuel. Now, he was a wireless operator. That would have been a photo taken just before they left. Didn't speak much about his wartime efforts. Some of the little things that popped up in his life meant that it was more than horrendous. Arrived in England 11th of April 1917, where he went to Salisbury Plain for further training. Left for France September 1917 and went into action at Ypres, Passchendaele, the Somme, Hill 60. The shelling that went on was quite horrendous. He said they got sick of walking across duckboards, because if they walked off the duckboard they could be up to more than their nose in mud and slush. And then he transferred from the 41st Battalion to the 4th Machine Gun Company, and they're Vickers machine guns. They have a water-cooled barrel and they have 2 off-siders, and they probably take it in turns to operate it and feed the clip in. He was taken a prisoner of war at Albert. And being a machine gun company, they were set down pretty well. They weren't a mobile group. They were in a position where they had to strafe anyone that got close to them. And apparently some German units went right around them and then pierced in and cut them clean off from their own forces. The order was passed down that they surrender. I don't know, he never said how many men, but it must have been a fair group of them, because they wouldn't just have one machine gun. Now, I made the silly question of, you know, what did they lock you in? And he said, oh no, they didn't lock us up. They didn't have to. They didn't feed us properly. And he maintained that he'd never in his life seen full-grown men crawling around their hands and knees and pulling the grass roots out of the ground and eating them. But the other thing they did, they used them as slaves, but he said they worked in the field hospital. They were used for operations where people might have to have legs amputated, and they were used to hold them down, and then also they were used to dispose of bodies, I suppose. He was held prisoner of war behind German lines in France until the 15th of November, when the enemy retreated. He told me that he was on leave, or pretty sure it's the town of Ypres, and just here is Stanley James there, and beside him is a pretty young lassie here, and I wouldn't mind betting he's got his arm around that young lady because she's smiling, and he's giving her a squeeze around the midriff. This is the men on the ship, either over or back. It could be coming back, but a lot of those men look very bedraggled. Some of them are smoking rolly cigarettes. Look like they haven't had a wash for a little while. But there's one gentleman in there, that's Stanley James there. When he stood without anything in his hands, he always put his thumb in his belt. Here's one. The one on the left here, those who fought for the Great War, 14 to 19. And then this other one is their service medal, which has, but then around the outside edge of the rim, 3079, private. He came home as a corporal also, by the way. He suffered with mustard gas poisoning from there, and when he was in his late years, I think he passed away about 85, he used to say, well, you wouldn't think he'd have his milkshake every morning, and it was dolomite from the Flinders dolomite mine just near Peak Crossing, and that was on their farm. And he said I have to use this to keep the lining on my stomach so they can digest food. So it was quite horrendous that they did that. And Stanley was married on the 20th of the 10th, 1919. So he didn't waste a lot of time when he came home, because he only got home in July. That's a photo of Stan's wife, and she was Ethel May Caswell, from a large family in Mergen, and her father was a sawmiller, and then he became the mayor of the Shire. He came here and was a bit of a developer, you might say. I think it happened with a lot of families after the First World War in particular. The families were big, the land was at its limits pre-war, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity, so they all went to a land of opportunity, and it started around Mundubra, Monto, and into the valley, into the Callide Valley around Thangool and Biloela. And I think they packed their family up when they arrived at Langley Flats, and they had a place there. The house is still standing there, and they, being a large family, he then bought a property up a side road about 2 kilometres away, and it was covered in brigalow. We also had one of the first wireless sets. My grandfather, with a friend's help, built a 5-valve radio and brought it down on the train from Rockhampton. The house was surrounded by giant dead ringbark trees, and my father shinnied up several of these to erect aerials in different directions so that we got a good reception from a number of broadcast stations. Dad was just 16 and he was with him off-siding. He was chopping brigalow scrub, and the idea was that they cut a lot of little ones partway through, and then they'd clear fell with a big fellow and he'd fall on top of the little ones and snap them all off. It shows the burnt brigalow or the scrub there, and they would walk through and plant the corn with a walking stick planter, and then they would pick it and then put it through a sheller, and then they would have the husk and that sort of thing as roughage feed for the cows. But that's one of my father on the back, Jim, and that's Wally here. He was the next oldest, and they're on a BSA motorbike. That's actually taken on the original home just next to Langley. While our Aussie boys fought in New Guinea to stop the Japanese advance, country people formed units of the Volunteer Defence Corps to fight guerrilla warfare if the Japanese should land in our country. Every Sunday, the farmers, led by my grandfather, Stanley James, who had military experience, would meet to train with 310 rifles and hand grenades. And most of the farmers were registered, and they did have a uniform, and they all had horses, and they had exercises. It was like a weekend thing, or whenever they had a gathering, and they had dinners afterwards. He was a great bloke. His laugh used to make his whole chest and his tummy jump up and down. I think anyone that did military service ends up with the personality they inherit. When a situation went wrong, his military personnel came right out to the forefront. In other words, it was a split decision that he could get on top of things straight away. And he was always that sort of person, didn't like mucking around. I think because his battalion, they were sort of there, and anything that walked in front of them was in trouble. And I suppose it was the same to the Australian guys that were trench men. Obviously, if we didn't come home, we all would be here. It's as simple as that.